I'm currently in Dallas for the premiere of The Chosen Season 5, but during the 4-hour drive to here from Houston, I actually was able to watch episode 6 of The House of David. And since I got to my hotel a little bit early and they said they need a little bit more time to prepare my room, I just kind of came out to my car and figured I could probably film my review video right here, right now. And so that's what we're doing. I've got some notes here on my phone. It's going to be a little bit more casual, but we're just going to hop right in and we're going to talk about episode 6 of The House of David. So let's get to it. Okay, right off the bat, since I'm sitting out here in my car, I'm not going to do this in a super formal manner. I'm not going to do a spoiler-free and spoiler section and stuff like that. We're just going to hop right in and I'm just going to talk freely. And so if you've watched episode 6, watch this video. If you haven't watched it, get ready to be spoiled or come back a little bit later. And I got to be totally honest with you, when it comes to this episode, I didn't really care for it that much. This was definitely the weakest episode in my opinion. I'll explain why in a second. But long story short, and it kills me to say this, I think that there were actually more things that I disliked in this episode than there were things that I liked. And like I said, that kills me to say it because I really liked the show so far, but there were just certain things in this episode that they just didn't do it for me. And I had a whole 4-hour drive to think about it, right? As soon as I got in my car, I watched the episode, so that was the first hour of my drive, and then I had 3 more hours to kind of think about it, and I was like, man, I think there were just a lot of things in this episode I wasn't a big fan of. And to me, it seems like the main issue is that there were certain places where the writers needed to get the characters by the beginning of the next 2 episodes that it seemed like a lot of the stuff felt super rushed, and it felt also very dramatic, right? Just looking at my notes here, one thing that I wrote is that the drama felt very contrived and overdramatic. It felt like a lot of the drama in this story was forced, but once again, it seems like it was forced in order to get these characters to certain locations by certain times, right? There's certain places where David needs to be, and where the Philistines need to be, and where Saul needs to be. There's certain places where they need to be at, and the previous episodes hadn't really set that up enough, and so this episode had to do that legwork, and so all the drama just felt like it was overblown and overdramatic to where a lot of the characters, they felt like they were acting out of character, right? They felt like they were being a lot more dramatic, and even some of the acting to me in this episode felt a little bit more dramatic. I'd be interested to see in the comments whether or not y'all were feeling that the same way as I was, or if maybe this is just me not understanding the episode the same way that y'all do. I don't know. I'd be interested to see what people's opinions are. I haven't really looked at anybody else's opinion because the episode literally came out today. But to me, it just felt very, very overdramatic. And therefore, it seems like they sped things up quite a bit. But let's just walk through the main plot lines. There's really 2 main plot points. Honestly, it's hard to say even that, because really, to me, this episode felt a little bit messier too, right? To where in previous episodes, there's been a clear like A, B, and C plot line, or it's just been one plot line for the whole episode. This one felt a little bit more jumbled. There's very clearly a Philistine plot line, and that's the plot line involving like Achish, the king of Gath, and then Goliath and the giants and stuff. And then there's this stuff where there's like David and Michal, but then there's also like the House of Saul stuff that's separate from that. And there's Jonathan and Samuel, and so basically it really seems like there's 2 main plot lines. There's the Philistine plot line and the Israelite plot line, but the Israelite one is just a little bit messier and kind of just all over the place. And once again, it's because there's so many moving parts that they needed to get people to a certain place by a certain time. And so we'll walk through each of those, right? We'll walk through the Philistine plot line, and then we'll talk about the Israelite one. First off, one thing that I did like is the opening to this episode. Honestly, going into the episode, I was like, oh, I'm really going to like this, because you have like this opening, probably like 3 or 4 minute long scene, which is just Orpa, and she is detailing the birth of the Nephilim. And it's taken straight from Genesis 6, but it pulls a lot from 1st Enoch and stuff like that, to where you have certain of the angels who are being named but by Orpa. And you basically have this really cool kind of like romanticized version of the birth of the Nephilim, to where you have this like super shredded angel showing up to a woman, and basically it's just like a poetic way of talking about them ultimately consummating their relationship and leading to the birth of the Nephilim, which you read about back in Genesis 6. I thought that was really cool. I thought that part of it was a little bit cheesy, but I thought it was supposed to kind of be, because the way that Orpa is telling the story to her children is in a romantic, epic, over-dramatic fashion. And so to me, I don't even know if it was supposed to be depicting this is what it actually looked like when these events took place, or if this is just how she is wanting the story to be depicted in her son's eyes, if that makes sense. I don't know. But I thought it was really cool, right? I was like, whenever I went into a show about the House of David, I can confidently tell you I was not expecting to see this. And so I think that it's really cool that they've been talking about that, right? This whole TV show has been very divine counsel worldview friendly. And that's something, if you don't know what that is, just go Google it. But the fact that they've leaned so much into the whole Nephilim aspect of the giants to me is really cool, because that's something that people don't talk about a whole lot in regards to Goliath and, his brothers and stuff. But this is something like, in preparing my deep dives for this season, which those are going to come out after all 8 episodes have aired and stuff. But in preparing my deep dives, I've actually been doing stuff in regards to the Nephilim and stuff, because I want to explain that in case people just didn't know exactly where they're getting this information and stuff. And I want to address that. But I just think that's really kind of cool that they are leaning into that, just because I've never seen it emphasized in tellings of the David story, right? Like in churches and stuff like that, people don't really talk about this because, honestly, sadly, in our churches, a lot of times we kind of stray away from the supernatural, which is weird because we talk about God, right? But for some reason in our, I don't know, people get really nervous about the supernatural, probably because we know so very little about it. But I'm glad that they're doing that, right? So I just wanted to say that's a positive to me. I really like the opening of this. And then I thought it was cool how Orpa says to her sons, "You are the last of the Nephilim." The idea that the Nephilim have been dying off, and that these giants are the last remaining ones. And sure enough, you'll see this in my deep dive video that we do eventually. But that is how the Bible presents it, right? There are the Nephilim at large, but then there's these people known as the sons of Anak, the Anakim. And they are a portion of the Nephilim, and they seem to be like the last portion that remains in the land of Israel at the time of David. And then, even then, there's only a few of the sons of Anak who are left, and it would seem to imply that Goliath and his brothers are amongst those sons of Anak, right? And so what she says there is consistent with the Bible, but it's also something that most people would probably overlook if you're just reading through scripture. Because oftentimes whenever we get to the foreign people groups, we don't pay close attention to who's who and where's where, right? We hear about the Amalekites, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Perizzites, the Perizzites, all that stuff. We look at those and we just kind of glaze past them. But in biblical theology, there is the Nephilim, and then there's the Anakim, which is like a small subset of them. And then there's also the term Rephaim, where like whenever you're looking in the House of David show, whenever it says they go to the Valley of the Giants, this is a reference to the biblical Valley of the Rephaim, right? Because Rephaim is a term that is used in general to refer to all sorts of things, but giants is one of them, right? And so I think it's kind of cool that they're emphasizing that. I find that really neat. But to kind of move along in this plot line, ultimately, Achish welcomes Goliath into Gath, and he gives Goliath his sword and his shield. And you just see that Goliath draws the sword, and he's like, "Yes, I like this. This will do." And the cool thing about that is that we ultimately know where this sword is going to end up, because it's going to end up slicing through Goliath's head, right? And we're going to see that in episode 8, I imagine. And we're going to see David hold that head up, and it's going to be crazy. But then David is actually going to take the sword and take it for himself. Moving on a little bit, I'm not going to talk about every single little plot point, just stuff that I wanted to highlight. A big conflict that we see in this episode is that Orpa wants Goliath to rule. I was wondering what they were doing with that plot, because obviously we know that Goliath does not become the king of Gath at any point, and Achish is going to be king for quite some time after this, even into whenever David's on the run from Saul and stuff like that. So I didn't know where they were quite heading with that plot point, but it did make sense later on, because it seems like, once again, it seems like they were just adding drama for the sake of drama. They wanted it to, I get why they were needing to do this though, right? Because they have made the giants and the Philistines not already partnered together, and therefore they needed to give some sort of hesitation between them, right? Because they didn't want the Philistines, like right now, like at the beginning of this episode, the giants don't really have any reason to fight on behalf of the Philistines. They don't have anything against the Israelites, right? And so in the context of the show, it makes sense why Orpa would have an agenda, right? Okay, they will fight for you if they get to rule. But obviously Achish isn't going to let that happen. And so that adds some dramatic tension into the show, because now you're wondering, okay, well, how are the giants going to come fight for the Philistines anyways, right? And ultimately that's resolved by the end of the episode, right? Because what we see is that Doeg the Edomite makes his return, and he does what he seems to do all the time in the show, and he kills people, right? And he specifically kills Orpa, but as he kills Orpa, he says he's doing it in the name of the house of Saul. And it seems like Doeg's a very interesting character, because you're trying to figure out what his ultimate agenda is here, right? Because it seems like he was almost working with Achish, right? And he was like saying, okay, I know what I can do in order to get the Philistines, like the giants on your side, right? And so that seems like that was what his goal was. But then you have to ask, okay, but it seems like Doeg was on Saul's side, right? And it seems like Doeg says this in the episode. He says that he serves the power, right? And so it seems like Doeg is simply a guy who will simply follow wherever power resides. And so if he thinks that the Philistines are the ones in power, he will serve the Philistines. If he thinks that Saul's the one in power, he will serve Saul. And so that's a very interesting development there. But ultimately, he goes and he kills Orpa. And that's kind of sad because while Orpa is very manipulative and weird and kind of creepy in the show, and once again, that's based off of Jewish tradition, she is a biblical character, right? She shows up in the book of Ruth. And so he is ultimately the one who kills her. And whenever Goliath finds her, she is in her dying breaths. She delivers the message that Doeg had given to her, right? Ultimately, that ultimately the house of Saul was responsible for this, and then she asks Goliath to take vengeance on her behalf. And to me, I did think that was like, I don't really have a huge issue with this. To me, it seems like she kind of fell for it. And one issue that I do have with like the Philistine plot line, and it's not a big issue, it's kind of just like I would present it differently. To me, it seems like they're kind of leaning into the idea of like Goliath and his brothers just being like big dumb oafs. And I know they're not just that, but to me, it's leaning into it a little bit more than I was expecting. Like I was like, I don't know, whenever I have like considered how I would depict Goliath, I've always wanted to push against the stereotype of like giants being like big and like not very smart. And they're pushing against that a little bit in this. But like just the way that they respond and stuff throughout the show, like it almost felt cartoonish. And that's kind of where I'm saying like the characterization didn't feel as real in this episode as it has in previous episodes, to where the giants, they just felt like cartoons to me in this episode throughout the entire thing. And so it seems like even Orpa in her dying breath, she fell for what Doeg was saying too quickly. Whereas obviously he seems to be manipulating her, right? And so, I don't know. I thought that was very interesting. Oh, that's fun. I just got a text from Brandon Snipe. I think we might be getting lunch in a little bit, so I probably need to speed this bad boy up. But yeah, so she asks Goliath to get vengeance, and so the Philistine plot line resolves with Goliath going in and basically kneeling down before Achish, and he says, "Hey, I will serve you," right? He goes and kills some random Hebrews before he does that. Then he comes in and he says that he wants a chance to fight Saul. He wants a chance to kill some Israelites, and he's going to show them who the real gods are. And that is one thing that I do like that they're emphasizing again in the show. The idea that from an ancient perspective, war was never simply a matter of human versus human, right? They viewed this as a conflict amongst the gods. And that would have never been more true than whenever you have Nephilim literally fighting in the battle, right? And Orpa does this throughout the episode. She refers to her sons as gods, right? And that's kind of how you would have viewed them, right? Because my personal theory is that the Nephilim are probably responsible for where we get most of our mythology, right? Whenever we talk about Greek and Roman mythology and we've got these demigod figures, I would not be surprised if a lot of those legends were more than just legends and they actually came from the stories of the Nephilim and stuff like that, right? And so, yeah, so I really like that they're leaning into that, to where Goliath views himself as a god, because that's what his mother has always taught him. And because there is a layer of truth to that, because from a biblical perspective, the Hebrew word for God is Elohim, and that is exactly what the Nephilim were, right? They were when the sons of Elohim, right, the Bnei Elohim, whenever they mated with the daughters of men, right, the Bat Adamah, right? And so whenever these two came together, they produced these hybrid creatures, which are kind of like half God, half human. And keep in mind that biblically there is a distinction to be made between most Elohim and then the most high Elohim, right, which is God himself, right? So there are many little g gods, but there is also the all-powerful God who's the creator of the heavens and the earth, and that would be Yahweh, right? Okay, so there's the Philistine plot line. I didn't have as many issues with that plot line as I did with the stuff going on over in the Israelite camp. But I don't know. Like, there's a lot of moving parts. I didn't have as many issues with it. It felt a bit cartoonish, but by and large, that was my favorite of the plot lines in this episode. It's the Israelite side of things where things really took more of a downhill spiral for me. Because David continues to just be dumb, right? And I hate saying that because I love David as a character. Like this is where I have a tough time like separating like my biblical understanding of the character from the show, because in my mind, you know, I've read the story of David since I was a little kid. I've studied it deeply. I've taken my own attempts at like representing the David story in a fictional format, right? So I have this idea of how I think David should be depicted, and it really just is not how they're doing it in this show. The first like 4 episodes was good, but really episode 5 is where it started taking more of a downhill spiral. And this episode, I honestly don't even understand David that much. And so let's just walk through it so I can explain a little bit more what I mean. And I'm not trying to come across too critical, because I understand that they were trying to fit this into 8 episodes. And to me, really, the most of my issues here could be explained by this episode just feeling rushed, to where characters make some very strange decisions that don't necessarily line up with their previous actions, and it's just kind of strange. But to me, it seems like this episode, the main goal was to get people from point A to point B, and they had to make some like logical jumps to get there. And so I sympathize with the writers, because it seems like that's kind of what's going on. But still, it just is kind of frustrating to me. And so I want to see what y'all's opinion are, to see if y'all found this as off-putting as I did. I still like the episode, just not nearly as much as the other ones, and there were more issues that I had than not. But okay, let's just walk through it. So, from the very beginning here, you've got Michal and Merab, right? And they're talking to each other. These are the 2 daughters of Saul. And they're talking to each other, and Michal admits that she was falling in love with David. But now she's ultimately conflicted about this. But right off the bat, this is where I began to realize, like, that was like the first like warning sign that this episode was going to be kind of weird to me, because her admitting that she was falling in love with David, to me, feels like it's so premature. And this is going to be an ongoing issue I have through the whole episode. The way that people are treating David and Michal throughout this episode is almost like they have had several months of history together. Whereas maybe time has been supposed to be passing more throughout the show than I really felt, but I felt like David's maybe been in the fortress for a few weeks, and it felt like him and Michal were just beginning to acknowledge their attraction to one another, right? To where, by and large, it was primarily a secret between them, but other people were noticing the attraction. But people are speaking about it as if this was like an established thing. To where, like, I don't know, the fact that Michal said that she was falling in love with him, in ancient cultures, would they have talked like that? Probably not. So, not really. But I mean, there's examples of it in the Bible, right? You know, you have people like, Jacob falling in love with Rachel, right? Would they have used that language? I'm not sure. But you do have examples of it, right? And obviously people were attracted to people back then. But the way that they're treating it just makes it seem to me like, I guess you could argue that they're teenagers and they're just deep in their feelings. But there's nothing in the show, to me, that comes across as critical of this, as if they're out of touch with reality. You know what I mean? Like, they would need to depict that to make it clear that the audience is not supposed to agree with them, that they were falling in love. So to me, it seems like the creators believe that they have presented David and Michal in such a way to where we think, oh yes, they were in love. But I just really hadn't felt that. To me, it seemed like these were 2 people who were beginning to be like, hey, I think I kind of like you. But now they're talking about that they were in love with one another, and that's going to be throughout the whole episode. And that was just strange to me, right? So Michal admits that she was falling in love with David, but now she's conflicted about it. And Merab's going to have a weird response to this later on, right? And so that was kind of strange. But then to cut to Saul, whenever he's like talking with the advisors, trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do, you can tell that he's still frustrated and everything by stuff. And there's just one little quote that I actually appreciated that they had him say in there, to where while he is, they're talking like battle plans and stuff like that, he says, "We have prevailed with gods at our back." And he says gods plural. And then he has to catch himself, because he realizes that, like it's almost like he has to ask himself, why did I say gods there? Is it because I just revealed the true contents of my heart, or is this part of my insanity, right? And I thought that was kind of interesting, to where he corrects himself and says, with God, because he realizes that he just said this publicly in front of everybody, and now everybody's like, did you just say that? I am getting so many phone calls and stuff while filming this video. I apologize. This is what happens whenever I'm filming with my phone, and I don't leave it in the other room. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. But cutting back to Michal and David, Michal ultimately does confront David, because keep in mind, the way the last episode ended was with him sitting on the throne, but that's not even what she confronts him about, right? I mean, whenever she's talking to Merab earlier, she gets like this flashback where she sees him sitting on the throne, but that's not even what she talks to David about here. Whereas to me, that seems like that's the thing that you would bring up. You'd be like, hey, have you been manipulating me? Because to me, that's actually necessary drama, right? If you see this guy who's been flirting with you sitting on the throne of your father, and you know that your father is concerned somebody might be wanting to take the throne from him, Well, to me, that's actually a legitimate drama. And so I would understand Michal being upset about that. But in this scene, that's not what Michal is upset about. Instead, Michal confronts David and asks why he didn't tell her who he was. Why didn't you tell me you were an illegitimate son? Why didn't you tell me that you were an outcast by your family? And to me, I was just like, why would he tell you that, right? Like, why are you entitled to know that, right? Like, that to me, that's not like, this is like an issue. Like, if you ever watched the TV show Smallville, Smallville is my favorite TV show ever. It's about young Superman before he's Superman. And in the early seasons of Smallville, there's this character named Lana, right? She's actually there way longer than she needs to be, right? And Lana is the cheerleader that Clark Kent has a crush on growing up in high school. She's like his dream girl. And as the show progresses, Lana becomes increasingly annoying, right? In the first few seasons, she's okay, but as the seasons progress, she becomes increasingly annoying, and that's because Lana feels entitled to Clark Kent's secrets. And she feels like he needs to tell her every single thing he ever does, and that's just not how it works. Like, to me, I cannot imagine going up to my friend and saying, why didn't you tell me every single little detail about your past? But this is something that always happens in TV shows and in movies, right? To where characters for some reason feel entitled to other people's secrets or to other people's backstories, where in reality they're just not. And so to me, it would make sense for Michal and David to have drama because she saw him sitting on the throne. It does not make sense for them to have drama because David didn't mention he was an illegitimate child. I don't know why she would need to know that, right? Like, that's like, I actually kind of stand with him on this point because he ultimately responds and says that he wanted to escape like that reputation, and like he thought she would judge him, and it seems like she kind of is, and she says that she's not, but I'm like, well, I don't know, you seem to think it's a bigger deal than it probably actually is, and so that whole thing was kind of weird. But then it gets even weirder because David proceeds to tell her that he wants to escape the palace with her, which is like the most cliche modern like rom-com development that to me came out of nowhere. I literally wrote that in my notes. I said, I'm not sure where this came from. It also seems very rushed because on one hand, like I've already emphasized, it seems rushed in the sense of I didn't get the impression that these people were in an established relationship. Like, yes, they've held hands, right? They touched hands in the previous episode, and then he had to run off. And as far as I know, that's like the last time they've encountered one another. And so it's not like they have this firmly established relationship. They haven't even talked about their feelings towards one another. Yet now he says that he wants to like escape the palace with her. Why would she want to do that? Right? Like I don't know why. Like, it's just very weird. It seems like David's out of touch with reality, which is a weird place to put your character without calling him out on it. Whereas it doesn't seem like they ever call him out on it. It just seems like this is a young guy who's like, we should escape and like go off and run away together. Why would she want to do that with you? Right? She is a princess and you are a shepherd boy. She barely knows you. She thinks that you might be stealing, like you might want to steal the dad's throne, even though she hasn't talked to you about that yet. Like, it's just like, that's kind of weird to me. But also, I don't know why David would want to escape the palace, right? To me, that's what I'm saying. It just seems like a very weird thing to say because I haven't gotten the impression that David didn't like the palace, right? I mean, plus, like, to me, I have an issue with it from a biblical perspective because if David is here to serve Saul, he's basically saying, I just want to run away from my responsibilities and be with this girl. Which does not ring true to me of how the biblical David was. Yes, there were times when David prioritized girls over his faith or girls over God and stuff like that. Yes, that happened. But whenever we read about the time period that David served in Saul's court in the Bible, all it has is praise to sing for him, right? That he was submissive to Saul and that everybody loved him and stuff. And so this whole plot development's really weird because they're establishing David and Michal as if they're well established in a relationship almost, that they're like way deeper in than I thought they were. And then also, it's making them sound like they're super discontent with where they're at. Whereas it doesn't, I just never really got that impression. I don't know why they would want to run off other than to simply be together. But once again, that's assuming that they knew that they both wanted to be together. To where it's almost like you're reading the Romeo and Juliet story into this, where it really hasn't been established yet, at least not between the characters. And so that was very, very strange to me. It seems very rushed. And then, to rush it even more, Michal says, one thing I know is this, I love you. And again, it just feels rushed, right? I was like, what? You love him? You don't even know this guy, right? Literally, this conversation began with you admitting to him that you didn't even know his backstory. You didn't even know that he was an illegitimate son. You didn't know he had a complicated past. The only thing you know about him is that he plays music and that he's nice to you. That is literally all you know about this guy, right? And now you're saying that you love him, despite the fact that apparently he's hiding a lot of stuff from you, and despite the fact that you literally saw him sitting on your dad's throne a few days earlier. To me, it just seemed really rushed, where I want to believe it. And I think that there is a version of this story where you could believe it, but it's almost like there needs to be an extra 2 or 3 episodes in between episodes 5 and 6 to make this feel not rushed, right? But that's what I'm saying. All of this could be explained by simply all of these things having to be fit together. And they're trying to explain why David ends up back in Bethlehem, right? And why all these characters are the way they are, and they're wanting to add the dramatic tension. But to me, it just felt way, way, way rushed. And then a little bit later on, David is sneaking around looking for Michal. Why? I have no idea. What is he planning on telling her? I have no idea. But this is simply what David does in the fortress. That's what I'm saying. It's making David very much a one-note character. It feels to me like they didn't know what to do with David once he was in the court of Saul, other than play music for Saul and hang out with Michal. It seems like those are the things. Whereas to me, this would be a great opportunity to develop Jonathan and David's relationship, because we know that they're gonna have the best friendship ever. Well, you could establish that. Whereas in this episode, we do get to see, in the scene I'm about to talk about, David and Jonathan really interact for the first time. But it's nothing that's developing a friendship. And if anything, it would just place seeds of doubt in Jonathan's head concerning David. But to me, there's plenty of things they could have done with David, but it seems like they don't really know what to do with him in this area. Because every time David's not with Saul, he's just looking for Michal, right? That's all he wants to do. And with David's the type of character where he doesn't even need to be around people. You could literally have him just go wander off by himself and play his music or pray to God or something, right? Kind of like how episode 5 opened up with him singing the Shema, sitting on the fortress wall. But instead, David gets up, he's going and looking for Michal. I don't know what he's planning on telling her, but he's not being very subtle about it. I feel like it's supposed to be in a rom-com, whenever the guy's running through the airport wanting to make some proclamation of love. But then Eliab sees him, and Eliab is furious, and he says, David, you need to go home. And it's not a good look whenever I'm actually agreeing with the brother. And maybe you're supposed to agree with the brother. I don't know. I don't know how the creators want us to necessarily feel about these scenes. I don't know if we're supposed to be on Eliab's side, on David's side, or what. Since David is our main character, I'm assuming we're supposed to be on his side unless there are clear implications otherwise. But I agree with Eliab. I'm no, David, you have been a mess ever since you showed up here. You have been only focused on this girl. You're wanting to abandon your duties and run off with her and make her a fugitive of the state and stuff. He's being very dumb. And so I agree with Eliab. Yeah, you do need to go home, David. And ultimately, it seems like that David's going to come to agree with this. Meanwhile, Jonathan shows up, and Eliab basically warns Jonathan, says, hey, this kid, David, has been nothing but a thorn in our flesh, in our family's flesh, since the beginning. Don't let him do the same to yours. Which is, I felt that was probably a little bit immature of Eliab, because Eliab should probably be a little bit more mature than that. Don't bring your family drama into Jonathan. But to be fair, David set the precedent, and so maybe this is just a family issue where they're all just a bit dramatic. That's what I'm saying. The whole episode, to me, felt everybody was being a little bit out of character, whereas I would have expected Eliab to be a little bit more reserved here. But I imagine that they're planting seeds that are going to, play out later on between David and Jonathan. But then, at the same time, David and Jonathan, they hear screaming coming from Saul's room, and so they rush there together. Why does David go with Jonathan? I don't know, right? It makes sense that Jonathan would rush to the king's aid. David, though, it seems like he's just not good at not intruding, right? He kind of just pushes himself everywhere he's not supposed to be, and so he goes in there too. And Jonathan walks in, he sees the witch of Endor, right? Or the witch, who's probably going to be the witch of Endor, right? He comes in, he sees her, he immediately kicks her out. He tells his mom, Ahinoam, God rules in this house. We're not allowing these pagans to be here and do this stuff. And whenever the witch is getting ready to leave, she runs into David. And she says that he is the cause of all of this, right? Because she's been seeing these visions of a lion. And now she sees David. And she's connecting the dots, right? He is the cause of the king's insanity. And what's interesting about that is that even though this is a pagan witch, she has insight to the truth. Which I think is an interesting idea to explore. And so I actually did like that. Again, how it's been executed to me, the whole episode just felt rushed. It felt like there was like boom, 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 just so much happening, and it just needed like some time to breathe. But I actually did like that plot point. Moving on just a little bit further, Saul does admit to David in kind of a weird scene, right? It cuts, so we cut to the Philistines, and whenever we cut back to David, he's been playing the harp for Saul, the lyre. He's been playing it for Saul to the point where his fingers are bleeding, right? So he's been playing for hours. And then Saul begins to tend to him. And Saul admits to David that Samuel has picked another, which surprised me, right? Like, the moment that he said that, I thought that maybe this was going to be like a dream sequence, because it seems so strange to me that the king would outright admit this to somebody, right? Especially because he's been in denial of it. But I think it's supposed to suggest that Saul senses he has a sense of like vulnerability around David that he doesn't have around other people. And to me, like, this is something where, so fun fact, after I review all 8 episodes, I'm actually going to release 3 episodes or 3 videos on this channel. I've already recorded them, but I'm going to release 3 videos where I actually share with you my pitch on a David story, right? Where I'm just going to kind of let you know my version of basically how the House of David season 1 could have gone. Not because I'm critiquing the show, but mainly just because I've already talked about several times throughout these videos that I have my own version of it where I've tried writing books and stuff. And so I figured I would just kind of like just throw those out to you. And what I'm talking about right here, where Saul feels this sense of vulnerability around David, that's something that I included in my story as well. However, I was going to be putting in a lot of work to try to make sure that you bought into that sense of vulnerability. And Saul would even admit that he doesn't know why he feels that comfortable around David. Whereas here, I mean, Saul and David, they've really interacted twice, right? They interacted once at the end of the last episode, and then now they're right here. And Saul is like treating David's wounds in this moment of like sweetness from Saul, which is kind of cool. But then he just starts saying, yeah, Samuel anointed another one. And he says, that's the source of where my insanity is coming from. And then he even begins to say, oh, well, like he says that David is going to replace him, right? But then at the end of all of this, it's revealed that ultimately he calls David Jonathan. And so the idea is that he's been insane this whole time. And therefore, I guess he assumed that it was Jonathan the entire time. And so he didn't think that he was taking care of David. He thought he was taking care of Jonathan. And then he thought he was telling Jonathan that Samuel had appointed another one. And then like he was sharing his concerns with Jonathan, which could make sense. But again, we haven't seen Saul and Jonathan have that sort of relationship either, right? Because so far in the episode, Saul has even been biting off Jonathan's head and saying like, you can't steal my throne either. And so to me, I guess you can attribute all this to Saul just being insane. And ultimately, that's why David says, okay, I don't think my music eased your mind as much as I thought it did. But to me, it was a very awkward scene because I kept thinking David was going to like wake up from a dream and that it was like a nightmare and he was just afraid of like it was like his fears coming to fruition. And I thought that would have been interesting because I was like, okay, now we're getting some more character development with David. But instead, it was just Saul thinking he was talking to Jonathan. And honestly, I'm not even sure if I interpreted that correctly. That's what I think that they were communicating. But I also just could have misunderstood it. I don't know. That was strange to me. That's funny. My phone autocorrected here. It's supposed to say Merab confronts David as he is leaving, but it autocorrected to metabolism confronts David, and I was confused what that was saying. So we fast forward a little bit, and now David decides he's just going to leave, right? He is just going to up and he's going to leave the fortress. Has Saul become fixed? Nope. David has just decided in and of himself he is not good enough to help Saul out, which is, again, to me that seems contrary to David's character in Scripture. He is not the type of person who would abandon his post because he thinks he's not doing good enough, and there's nothing within Scripture that would suggest that this happened, right? I guess hypothetically you could argue it's possible, but biblically it doesn't seem to be the case. Again, in my version of the story, I had to explain how David ended up back in Bethlehem with Jesse at the beginning of 1 Samuel 17, right? I did it in a different way. And so if you want to hear that way, we'll just wait a few weeks and I'll be releasing those videos. But to me, it seems like that's the main issue they were facing, right? They just got David into Saul's courts, but by the time you're at the beginning of 1 Samuel 17, David's back home in Bethlehem. And so I think they had to figure out how to do this. And so they said, okay, well, let's up the drama with Michal, and let's up the drama with Saul, and let's make David feel like a failure so that he will just leave on his own accord. But the issue with that to me is that that makes David's character look really bad. So not only is he not very smart as a character, but he's also not very, like, reliable, right? Like, these people brought him in, like the king himself brought him in to help him out, and he just abandons him, right? And Michal is going to confront David about this, but Michal has, like, such a weird vibe, right? To where it's like she's flirting with David, and, like, you know, to where, like, she, like, goes to, like, touch him and stuff, and David draws away, and David asks, like, what was that about? And it's really hard to tell, right? I can't tell if Michal was, like, it could be that, as, you know, like I think it's been evident throughout the episodes that Michal is jealous of Michal in many ways, because Michal is the daughter who things kind of come more naturally to. And so to me, it almost seems like maybe it's suggesting that Michal, like, she was jealous of what Michal and David had, and so, like, she kind of wanted to steal David for herself. It could be that, or it could be that, like, I don't know, like, I also thought maybe this is, like, Michal trying to test and see if David is truly faithful to Michal, right? To where, you know, Michal said that she loves David, and so Michal's like, okay, well, let's go test and see if he actually loves you. And so, like, was she was flirting with him as a test? I don't know. It was very weird. Like, I don't know. We don't know the character well enough to be able to figure this out. And I guess you could try to argue, oh yeah, that's, like, they're trying to be clever with it. You're not supposed to know. But if you don't know, like, this is one of those instances where if you don't know, it doesn't make the story better. It just makes the story more confusing, if that makes sense. So Michal does confront David, and ultimately, she is flirty, but he does respond and say that he loves Michal, but he knows their futures aren't aligned. And once again, it just feels so rushed, right? To where, like, it's like, to me, it just feels like more contrived drama that didn't necessarily need to be there, and they could have focused on other things. In my version of the story, as we'll talk about in a few weeks, I had David and Michal meet each other early on, and then Michal, she's interested in David, but if anything, he just finds her, like, not annoying. Like, he finds her pretty, but he's just not interested in her in that way, because in my version of the story, he's so focused on serving Saul, and he's so consumed on making sure he's doing the right thing, that he doesn't even really focus on girls. And, like, to me, the Michal thing was going to be for, like, later on, once David was a warrior in Saul's army, and things started coming more natural to him, then he was going to focus on that. Whereas to me, it seems like they're almost, like, trying to pack too much in there, and I think it's because they wanted a romance subplot, right? But to me, it just feels way too rushed. So David does say that he does love Michal as well. Whereas, like, I don't think you know her well enough to be able to say that, right? And so, to me, that was just very strange. But then David just abandons, right? He says, yeah, the queen agrees that I'm not doing any good here. We never saw David and the queen have that conversation. I guess it happened off screen. But later on in the episode, there's a point where Ahinoam is talking with Saul, and she says, yeah, David left, and she seems kind of disappointed by it too. So, I don't know if David was making up the fact that Ahinoam agrees he needs to leave, or if they had the conversation and Ahinoam forgot, or maybe she miscommunicated. I don't know. It was just all very weird to me. But David just, like, ditches Saul to go back home to Jesse. And again, it's a way to get him back home, and I think that's mainly what they were needing to do. But it's weird to me. Meanwhile, Jonathan decides that he's going to go on a journey. And I didn't know where he was going, but along the way, he has a vision of him and his dad's death. Remember, Saul saw this before as well, so this is going, it's looking forward to the end of the events of 1 Samuel, which I imagine we'll see probably either next season or the season afterwards. But then, lo and behold, Samuel shows up out of nowhere. Turns out that's who Jonathan was looking for, and they start wrestling. And it, like, came out of nowhere. Like, I literally had to rewind it because I thought that I had, like, missed something. But Samuel just jumps out of nowhere, and they just start, like, wrestling with one another, and it literally made me start laughing. And maybe it was supposed to make you start laughing, but I don't know. Like, I don't know if it was supposed to be an intense scene or not, but Samuel just, like, shows up and is like, just, like, attacks, and you're like, oh, okay, that was interesting. And then, ultimately, Jonathan says, it's me, Jonathan, and Samuel just stops and says, oh, why didn't you say so? And that was supposed to be funny. But was the stuff ahead of time supposed to be funny? I don't know. It was just, it was kind of goofy to me. And then, what's even goofier, and I don't even know if it's goofy. I understand what they're going for. But, like, they're at Mount Sinai, which is a way further journey than I thought Jonathan was going on. Like, I thought Jonathan was going on, like, a one-day journey, just, like, over the hill somewhere else. I did not know that he was going to take a multiple-day-long journey across, like out of Israel, either to Arabia or the Sinai Peninsula, wherever you decide where you think that Mount Sinai is at. That's a pretty long journey. It's not unprecedented that people go make that journey, right? Obviously, the Israelites made that journey. Obviously, Elijah, he went down to Mount Sinai at one point in the story. I just was not expecting that, right? Like, whenever I saw that, like, I was like, you're at Mount Sinai? What? Like to me, that was like the most random thing. I had to rewind that again, too. And I had to turn on the subtitles to make sure I heard it correctly. And then later on, they even said, like, oh, yeah, Moses delivered the law from this mountain. I was like, yep, that's Mount Sinai. That was crazy to me. I don't know. That was interesting. But yeah, so they're at Mount Sinai, which was interesting. Samuel and Jonathan talk for a little bit, and Samuel makes it clear that he blames Saul for all the issues that are going on, not Jonathan, because Jonathan's been a great guy. This is where Samuel's basically explaining that Jonathan's awesome and is paving the groundwork for Jonathan and David to be best friends. But I will say that so far, I like the character of Jonathan more than David. Because Jonathan, to me, he's showing the characters of being a man after God's own heart. Whereas to me, we haven't quite seen that with David yet. And so I'm hoping these last 2 episodes of the show going forward will be able to kind of change my opinion on that. But ultimately, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And then Jonathan asks the question. He says, is it true that you have anointed another one? Because this has been the rumor, right? And Samuel says, before I answer that question, I need you to tell me, who are you allegiant to? Right? The implication being, are you allegiant to Saul, your dad, or to God himself? And technically, just by that question, you already know the answer, right? Because you would only have to ask that question if he actually had anointed somebody. But Jonathan answers, and he says, I am allegiant to God, right? Like he's devoted to God, which is cool. And then ultimately what happens is that Samuel admits that he did anoint a king whose kingdom will have no end. And this is talking about David, obviously. And it's paving the way for David and Jonathan's friendship, right? Which I imagine we'll kind of get hints of it in the next 2 episodes, I imagine. But it'll probably be fleshed out in season 2. Which I believe that season 2 has officially been greenlit, which is super exciting. And that's cool. That's a cool development. To me, I've always visualized it, and once again, this is just my own fault because I need to just judge the show on its own merit, not on my own preconceived notions of how the story could be told. I've always enjoyed the idea more that Jonathan just kind of came to the realization of David on his own, right? And in the show, I imagine they're still going to do that, right? To where now Jonathan knows for a fact that somebody else has been anointed, but he doesn't know who that person is. And so I imagine Jonathan will begin to realize, oh yes, David is that person. But like in my version of the story, it was going to be something that just like over time, Jonathan was just going to figure it out. And he wasn't going to tell David that right away. But then a little bit later on, like probably, like as David and Jonathan just continued to bond and stuff like that, eventually it would just come out and Jonathan's like, oh yeah, I know you're going to be king. I'm not jealous or anything. I know it's fine. And he's going to basically like, you never, like in my version of the story, you would never actually know when it clicked in Jonathan's head because he simply didn't care, right? For him, he just loved David and he loved God and he was fine with whatever. Like for Jonathan, it was never about being king. And so, but they're still going to probably do something like that, I imagine. But here we do have Samuel explicitly telling him this. I'm not sure why it had to take place at Sinai other than for a cool name drop. This could have happened at really any hill. But then I guess they were also trying to explain like why like Jonathan could find Samuel. But that was interesting too, because like they said, like Samuel said, how did you know to find me here? And Jonathan says, what hill is holier than Nob? And I was like, well, I could think of several, right? I was thinking like before they said Sinai, I thought it was going to be like, oh, maybe it's like Mount Moriah or, maybe like Shiloh or something like, but nope, it was Sinai. And I was like, okay, that makes sense because Sinai is a really holy hill from a biblical perspective. But, I don't know, that was just interesting to me. And then ultimately, this is the scene I alluded to a second ago. Later on, Saul does ask for David, and he says that he needed David. But David ain't there, because David ditched him. And so now we have a moment where literally, like, the king voices his need for spiritual help, and he voices his need for David, and David's not there because David has gone home. And to me, like, it's such a weird place to put your character in. So, yeah, I don't know. Very strange episode. I don't know what to do with it, and I honestly hope that y'all appreciated the episode more than I did. Again, I still like the show a lot, and I like that shows like this are being made, but this episode just really did not do it for me, and I wish I could say it did, because I love the David story, and I love that biblical shows are being made like this, but this is the first episode where I was like, I don't know. I'm hoping that the next 2 episodes are better, because like really like episodes 1 through 5 are like up here for me, and this episode is like, it's quite a bit lower. Episode 5, like I had some issues with, but I still like the episode by and large. Whereas this episode, it was like the cons outweighed the pros pretty significantly. And so that's kind of a bummer. But that being said, I want to hear from y'all in the comments, so please let me know what y'all thought about this episode, and I will talk to y'all later. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Remember who you are. Now I'm going to go check into this hotel, and I'm going to go watch The Chosen Season 5. Peace out. Bye.